So in the case study that I sort of presented to you, I slowly sort of started kind of building up the concept of a volume of a shape that was inside of the elements that I was constructing, and you know, uh, based on like how I did it, you can see how sometimes based on the arrangement of the shapes, it creates a very strong image of a volume between it, and sometimes based on those arrangements, the concept of that volume becomes a lot weaker. And so by using by using the shapes, we can sort of adjust the quality, adjust the definition of that volume, and that becomes a lot more important as we sort of move forward into later parts of this course. But let's go ahead and go over a little bit more in detail how that's done. So affecting spatial definition, we can talk about this idea of like how do you reinforce spatial definition? How do you weaken it? Sometimes sort of desires to express the space in one way sort of weaken the space in another way, and so if it's very important to you in this particular scene that you're creating for a level to have a very understandable space, then you need to understand how to sort of reinforce that. So starting out, one thing that we can very clearly sort of do to create the sense of a volume is to work on the skeletal structure. So we did that early on in the as I was demonstrating with the points and the lines showing the outer edges, and I'll get to this in a second, but we'll go through this real fast. So another way is through articulation, by creating sort of lines and points along sort of the overall shape through pattern alignment. So overall patterns within this space can either assimilate with the overall pattern of the volume of the shape, or they can interfere with that volume. And I'll show this in just a second. Value differentiation. If you're able to sort of create kind of a very noticeable difference between different elements, you can see those, how they are different and how they sort of interrelate. So if you were to color, for instance, one wall purple and another wall yellow, you can see very clearly how sort of their intersection is the difference between those two colors, and it creates a much stronger sense of the overall whole. And finally, edge integrity. So the edges of our defined space, if they are more intact, it creates a stronger sense than if the shapes sort of bleed over. Let's go a little bit more into kind of how each of these are done. So starting out with the skeletal structure. So looking at sort of kind of an idealized sort of very easy to read volume here created by four planes. But you can see sort of each of the four corners of this room, but if I were to, for instance, sort of round the back corner, it starts to create sort of an ambiguity with that corner. It makes it a lot harder to read and differentiate between one wall and another, and it creates just a little bit of a weakness here to the overall form compared to sort of the sort of intact and very squarish version. But if we really wanted to go the other way and to really emphasize the structural skeleton of this this room, we could put some columns in here. We could put some beams sort of in baseboards sort of along the outer sort of corners of this. So this is emphasizing the structural, the skeletal structure of this volume. So the outer lines, the outer contours, the points, we have these little sort of I guess harder wood corners in here, defining sort of the 8 points of our rectangular structure, and all the lines are sort of represented as well. So this is skeletal structure articulation. Another way that we can articulate sort of the shape of this is through kind of surface articulation. So here I've kind of pulled back on the the skeletal sort of articulation here, so you don't necessarily see very strong corners and points and stuff like that. But what you do see are sort of these, this repetition of these linear elements along the outer the outer planes. The base plane has this checkerboard pattern, and the perspective very clearly shows you that you sort of understand kind of how the volume, I guess, of how deep this is, because you sort of understand, like if you were standing here, you would understand, okay, this is this width, and you understand that looking over here, this cube over here, this square over here is sort of the same width, and it creates a very clear sense of volume, because what we're doing here is reinforcing the planes that construct that volume, which is sort of one step below the actual volume itself. But instead of just surface articulation, we could also articulate the volume itself. So here's an example of volume articulation, where we take these linear elements, these columns, and space them at regular intervals to create a very strong sense of just the overall the volume that is taken up inside of this rectangular space. So here it's done using linear elements, using columns. Here is another example that's done using planes. So we use these walls to sort of subdivide the space up. And if you were standing here, you could very much understand that, okay, this width is very much equal to this width, and it, I guess, gives you a very strong sense of what the actual space is, because a lot of times sort of volume is a very sort of vague notion that is kind of in our head, and the more we're sort of like able to relate kind of the space that's nearest to the space that's far away, it creates a stronger sense of overall volume. And of course, we don't have to do it with planes that sort of visit or extend from the ground to the ceiling, because this kind of obscures our view. But if we had a case where, like, I don't know, maybe this is a record store or something like that, and we have these shelves that are sort of aligning and sort of breaking up the volume of the space, the sale sign that's extended from the ceiling also creates sort of a plane that's in alignment with the other planes of the space, and it gives a very strong sense of volume. But if we were to take this and say this is a record store after the apocalypse, and turn these objects sort of sideways, what we have here is a pattern interference. So in, I guess, the previous case, like, this because we these 3D space, or sorry, these repeating elements are used throughout the volume, it creates a very it does create a very good articulation of the volume. But due to the pattern interference here, and what I mean by that is that these objects do not align with the rectilinear lines of the overall space, they're sort of starting to blur or hide sort of the overall volume. So it's a little harder to understand the shape of the volume, because the patterns don't fit up with the lines of the space. They interfere with it, and you have to sort of like look past them and see the actual lines that define the boundaries of the space. So they're not the objects here in the middle. They're not this diagonal sort of shape. It's these ones back here. And while it's not really necessarily that difficult of a thing, it's just having these things that interfere with the overall pattern are creating a slight sort of masking effect. And then the next concept I want to talk about is edge integrity. So in this case right here, we have walls that are sort of extending out. They don't end right here at the edge of the defined space, or I'm sorry, right here. They don't end there. The ceiling extends out farther. These outer walls extend out farther. These low cover walls or extend from inside the space to outside of the space. And what this does is really kind of blur the lines about where does the space start and where does it end. Is it defined by the ground plane here, these steps here, or was it defined as the space that's underneath this this overhead plane? So these elements really aren't sort of working directly with one another. They're sort of competing a little bit, and sort of the edges of what are the defined positive space are sort of bleeding out into the outer space. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because essentially what this is doing is making it so that there's a positive space in this corner that has a relationship with the exterior space that's out where I guess we are standing, where the camera is viewing. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're creating a combat space, you see very well how like this space sort of interacts with that space, and this feels like an overall cohesive space, as opposed to if this was like walled up corner with a door in there. It's very hard to see how those spaces interact, and there's not a lot of freedom there. But here there's a lot of freedom, but it's sort of at a cost of the integrity of the understanding of the volume that we wanted to create. So depending on the type of level or the type of situation, then if you are ending up with a space that does not feel like you have an identifiable volume, you could help that by bringing in sort of the bleeding of the shapes as they extend beyond. Here's sort of another example of kind of same idea where lines sort of extend beyond the boundary of the shape, but because we have a strong sort of correlation of the overhead plane and the base plane, it still creates a very strong sense of a volume, despite the fact that the wall planes are not cooperating. So here's a combination of a number of different, I guess, issues that are sort of affecting the overall, the very clear expression of the volume. So once you're finished with the block out and you hand it off to artists, a lot of times it will come back with sort of like prop placement like this. And the truth be told, a lot of times this is kind of like how I will, a lot of times my block out will kind of look like this. But just to, I guess, speak about how environment art often comes back with various ways that it's sort of masking the intention of the space. And so in this case, we've got these two tree elements, which are sort of blurring and blocking the outer lines of the left and the right. So they're still there, you can see them, but they're masking them, so it's a little harder to see. We've got some shrubbery here. I'm not sure why you have shrubbery underneath a base plane. I guess the rain wouldn't get there and stuff like that, but at least conceptually, it's essentially these organic shapes are covering up the concept of the points in these corners. These organic sort of like dirt piles are clouding our judgment of this line and this point right here. We've got a vertical line here that, instead of being aligned with the rectilinear understanding of a rectangular space, it's here at a diagonal, and it's sort of playing off and interfering with the patterns that we're trying to create as a volume, and it creates a nice like dynamic between kind of the rectangularness of the shape. And I guess this thing is a little bit dilapidated. It's falling down. It's creating a nice sort of interest point for the space. But as far as like strictly how it interacts with the volume of the space, it's blurring it a little bit. And the same thing with these elements along the wall are sort of blocking these lines. The vines and stuff like that this ivy is sort of blocking these lines. This object here in the middle is blocking our view. It's obscuring our view of this line over here, and it's also at a off-kilter sort of thing, which is playing against the patterns of the space. However, if we were to stand from this and see how can we sort of how can we keep this arrangements of sort of props, but try to get more of a sense that of the space. If we feel like we want to express the space stronger, we could start with contrast with differentiation. So here I've created one wall that is one color and one color wall that's the other color, and that very clearly means that this is not a single wall back here that doesn't curve, or I guess it possibly could curve, but it very distinctly sets one wall versus the other. So this is reinforcement. And here is even stronger case where essentially we're articulating the outer planes, the vertical planes, the wall planes of this space with strong elements that do build up a pattern of planes here, and got the windows. We understand we've been in buildings like this. We understand how a wall and a window work, and how this is generally going to be a flat surface, and this right here is another flat surface that interacts with it. And then out here I've created this little fence here that sort of helps to reinforce this line in the outer plane of this sort of space.